So in this session, we're just going to ask the simple question, how do you read the Bible? Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? Imagine if you worked in a library and you had to return or replace all the return books into the correct places on the library shelves. And you have 66 books on your trolley and you set off. Where do you put which book of the Bible? That's the picture. So, okay, Leviticus. So where does Leviticus go? All right, well, let's go for the law section. That's the category. Leviticus is mostly about law, isn't it? How about Chronicles? Oh, that's easy, isn't it? History, that goes into the history section. 900 and something on the Dewey Decimal. Okay, how about Psalms? Psalms, well, probably poetry. Right, put in the English literature poetry section over here, translated. Now about Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, is that sort of like philosophy or self-help? The book of Revelation, does that go in the mystery section? Is it, what kind of category is the book of Revelation? What about the book of Ruth? Is that romance, Mills and Boon? Now, there are some with more than one category. The Gospels, for example, contain biography, history, theology. But as John writes in John 20, these things are written that you might believe. So they are gospel tracts, evangelistic tracts, perhaps, if there was such a section. So do you see what you're doing? You are sorting out the genre of the book that you're looking at. And it's important, because each literary genre has its own rules of engagement. I can't read a shopping list as if it was a poem. They contain different types of information. They're both useful, but they're useful in different directions. And what happens if you do try to read a shopping list as if it's a poem? Well, you don't get very far. You misinterpret what you've been reading. Now, for example, the Song of Solomon is quite clearly a love poem. And perhaps it does have some application to the way that relationships operate. And perhaps even perhaps it has a relationship to the way that the church and Christ relate. But application is not the same as meaning. So we start with the genre and we circle into meaning. What kind of meaning? Okay. But first, we have to decide, we have to find out what a particular text originally meant. And second, out of that, we have to discover a transferable principle. That's the application. How does this ancient document relate to me now, living as I do? What's the principle of action that can transfer from that text to now? Okay, so it's first a matter of exegesis and then a matter of application. But those two things are different things. Now, the particular status of the Bible in both Judaism and Christianity rests upon the conviction that it's a particular kind of text, that it is a receptacle of divine revelation. Now, that thought needs some careful unpacking. And there's not one uniform hermeneutical principle for its interpretation. Some might argue that its interpretation must always be literal. But that's not an entirely helpful remark, because some of them are not intended to be literal. If this is the hand of the Lord, it's not talking about a literal hand, and so forth and so forth. And others take that direction and they say, well, everything everything that's said has a deeper spiritual meaning, because God's message and God's truth is self-evidently profound. So they're looking for a meaning, a deeper meaning than is sometimes there. For example, you might read the bit where Paul says, "Don't forget to bring me the cloak that I left at Troas." You say, "Oh, this must have a deep meaning." Well, no, it's about an item of clothing that he left. And he wants the guy he's writing the letter to remember to bring it. So its literal meaning is just that. It doesn't have a deep spiritual truth to tell us, apart from maybe look after your property. So others notice sensibly that some parts of the Bible must be treated literally and other parts figuratively. This is just common sense. And in the history of biblical interpretation, 4 major types of hermeneutics have emerged. And these are the literal, the moral, the allegorical, and the anagogical. Literal interpretation, which is mostly what we're going to be concerned with, that asserts that a biblical text must be interpreted according to the plain meaning, which is conveyed by its grammatical construction and its historical context. And the literal meaning is held to correspond to the intention of the authors. What did the person who wrote this mean it to mean? But this type of hermeneutics is often, but not necessarily, associated with belief in the verbal inspiration of the Bible, according to which the individual words of the divine message were divinely chosen. And this is treating the author as if he or she is a tape recorder, just writing down, just receiving what has been sent and then writing it down with no part of their personality interfering. It is just like automatic writing. Sorry, what do you say after the? What do you say after cloak? And that is not realistic, but I've phrased it in an extreme form so you can see the issue that might rise from it. And extreme forms of this view are criticized for this, that they don't account adequately for the evident individuality of style and vocabulary found in the various biblical authors. You might think, for example, of the 4 Gospels that we have, 4 stories of Jesus. And they're all utterly different. They don't really materially contradict, but they're all utterly different in the way they present things, in their interests, in their concerns, in their context, in their audience, in everything. So it's essentially the same story told 4 ways. And that tells you some very important things, that God is interested in individuals, and that our individual personality is not being subjugated to divine words coming like thunderbolts from on high, but something different is happening, that God is working through people, which is what the incarnation means, isn't it? Okay, so we can push verbal inspiration too far until it becomes inaccurate, an unhelpful way of understanding the Bible. Now, there's a second way of reading of biblical hermeneutics, which is moral interpretation, which seeks to establish exegetical principles by which ethical lessons may be drawn, as if you're reading it all like, and the moral is, it's a bit like a Sunday school, and the moral is, now boys and girls, what's the answer? Okay, and allegorization was often employed in this endeavor, and in the letter of Barnabas, which was written probably around 100 AD, interprets the dietary laws prescribed in the book of Leviticus as forbidding not the flesh of certain animals, but the vices associated with those animals. you see the point? And do you see the problem? Because as soon as you go in that direction, there's no stopping you. You can almost say anything out of anything. And a third type, allegorical interpretation, takes you even further, interpreting the biblical narratives of having a second level of reference beyond those persons and things and events explicitly mentioned in the text. And a particular form of that is typological interpretation. The key figures, the institutions of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, are seen as types and foreshadowing of the persons, events, and objects in the New. And according to this theory, for example, interpretations such as Noah's Ark is a type of the Christian church. And that was intended by God from the beginning. So I hope you see how fanciful and how unrestrained this application can be, and why we're making a plea here to start with the plain meaning, start with what the author meant it to mean, and separating that from the application, from the principle, the transferable principle to where we live. Now, Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher and very interestingly a contemporary of Jesus, employed, well, Greek philosophy in order to interpret the Jewish scriptures. And these practices were adopted by Clement of Alexandria into the Christian era. And he founded the School of Alexandria, which at one point was the biggest library in the world. It was an intellectual center, like the world has never seen before or since, really, after it was destroyed. And he pushed the allegorical technique to a much more extreme level. So he found deep philosophical truth in the plain narratives and precepts of the Bible. And then Origen, who followed him, systematized these into the literal, the moral, and the spiritual. But he said the spiritual, what he meant by that was the allegorical, was the highest. And this is expanded in the Middle Ages into the allegorical and the anagogical. And that suggests that all events in the Bible are used as a way to point towards their eternal significance. So it's an adaptation of allegorical, really. The parting of the Red Sea is like God bridging the gap between earth and heaven. And the wandering in the desert could be seen like our spiritual life. And I think you've probably heard preachers, maybe you do this yourself, using the stories in Scripture in that way. I think Paul does that in the New Testament about stories in the Old Testament, right? So we can see how that goes, but it's like an application. It's like using it as a picture, but what it is not is what that text originally meant. So I always want to say, well, both. I want to use that material and use it like a parable, work through it, but it is not what that originally meant, not what the author meant it to mean. So here's our discussion point, and this is where I want to stop now and to ask you to reflect. Here comes the point. Here's a quote. The plain meaning of the text is what the author meant it to mean. And this is where we start. We consider the genre, the bit in the library where we're looking. We examine the context of the book. Is this a shopping list or a poem? And we begin with a common sense analysis. And only then do we consider a transferable principle. And then all these things come into play. What is the moral value of what we're looking at? What's the spiritual foreshadowing that we see here that leads on to something? What ethical standard of living can we transfer from this story into how we live today? Okay, we'll stop at that point. So have your discussion, and I will see you in the next session, and we'll follow it on. All right, well done.